The moment the screen went black, panic erupted behind it. Phones rang non-stop, faces drained of colour, and within minutes, Westminster was hit by a shock no one was prepared for. A live broadcast, a sudden revelation, and a political team collapsing in real time. It unfolded live without warning, and that is what made it so devastating. As cameras rolled and anchors struggled to maintain composure, details of a massive internal scandal began spilling out in real time. What started as a routine political segment quickly turned into a breaking news nightmare for Keir Starmer. Viewers watched as information surfaced suggesting deep internal failures at the very heart of his leadership team. Within minutes, the story escalated beyond damage control. Behind the scenes, panic spread faster than the broadcast itself. Senior aides reportedly rushed into emergency calls, trying to verify what had already been exposed on air. The problem was not just the allegations themselves, but the timing. This was not a controlled leak. This was live television, and the narrative was no longer in government hands. As the broadcast continued, confirmation followed. Resignations were already underway. According to sources, Starmer was informed moments after the first revelation aired. Witnesses say his reaction was stunned silence. This was not a single advisor stepping aside. This was systemic collapse. One by one, members of his core team signalled their departure, citing loss of trust and inability to continue under mounting pressure. The image of unity that had been carefully maintained for months shattered instantly. Then came the second blow. Reports began circulating that dozens of MPs were preparing to walk out in protest. By the time the broadcast ended, the number had reached 43. This was no symbolic gesture. It was an organised exit, coordinated and deliberate. MPs who had once stood firmly behind Starmer were now distancing themselves publicly, fearing political fallout from a scandal still unfolding. Inside Westminster, the atmosphere turned toxic, corridors filled with whispered conversations and urgent movement, phones buzzed with messages from donors, journalists, and foreign observers. Everyone wanted answers, and no one had them. The leadership vacuum was immediate and visible. Without his team, Starmer appeared isolated, surrounded by uncertainty rather than support. The scandal itself remained partially unclear, but its impact was undeniable. It raised questions about oversight, judgment, and internal culture. Critics seized the moment, arguing this collapse proved long-standing concerns about leadership competence. Supporters struggled to defend what they could not yet fully understand. As the night progressed, one truth became unavoidable. This was not just a bad news cycle. This was a structural breakdown happening in public view. A prime minister facing the sudden loss of his entire inner circle. Dozens of MPs walking away, and a country watching its political stability fracture live on television. As the shock began to settle, the scale of the collapse became impossible to ignore. What initially looked like a sudden reaction to a breaking scandal now appeared to be the result of long-building internal tension. Insiders revealed that warnings had existed for weeks, quietly ignored in favour of keeping a fragile sense of order. The live broadcast did not create the crisis. It exposed it. Inside Labour headquarters, emergency meetings ran through the night. Remaining staff worked under extreme pressure, attempting to piece together a response while senior figures exited one after another. Each resignation added weight to the story, confirming to the public that this was not speculation but reality. Trust had fractured internally long before it broke on screen. The walkout of 43 MPs sent an even stronger signal. This was not a rebellion driven by ideology alone. Sources say many MPs feared being associated with a leadership that now looked unstable and compromised. Some cited moral concerns, others spoke of reputational damage. But the common thread was fear of political survival. Staying loyal suddenly seemed riskier than leaving. Keir Starmer attempted to project calm, but those close to him say the pressure was overwhelming. He was no longer managing disagreement. He was facing isolation. Without his core team, decision-making slowed dramatically. Statements were delayed. Messaging became inconsistent. Each pause fed speculation that the leadership no longer had control over events. Media coverage intensified with every hour. Analysts debated whether the scandal would trigger further resignations or even force Starmer himself to step aside. International observers began questioning Britain's political stability. Allies requested briefings. Opponents sensed opportunity. The story had expanded beyond party politics into a broader concern about governance. Behind closed doors, remaining Labour figures argued over next steps. Some pushed for immediate transparency, believing openness could limit damage. Others urged restraint, fearing that releasing partial information would worsen the situation. This division paralysed response efforts. While they debated, the narrative continued forming without them. Public reaction shifted from shock to concern. Viewers who watched the scandal unfold live now questioned how deep the problem truly ran. Confidence in leadership eroded further as explanations failed to materialise. Social platforms amplified rumours, filling gaps left by official silence. By the end of the second day, one conclusion was clear. This was no longer a temporary crisis. It was a test of endurance, a leader stripped of his team, a party divided by fear, and a political system struggling to contain a collapse that had already become public history. By the third day, the crisis had entered a more dangerous phase, where uncertainty itself became the main threat. With no clear explanation offered and no visible leadership recovery, speculation hardened into belief. What began as questions turned into assumptions, and those assumptions shaped public opinion faster than any official statement could. The absence of clarity allowed the scandal to grow beyond its original scope. Within Westminster, confidence continued to drain away. MPs who had not joined the initial walkout began distancing themselves quietly. Meetings were cancelled, public appearances were postponed. Even long-time allies avoided cameras, unwilling to defend a leadership they feared might not survive the week. The sense of paralysis was unmistakable. Power had not transferred, but it had stalled. Keir Starmer's attempts to stabilise the situation faced constant setbacks. Advisers who remained urged decisive action, yet every possible move carried risk. Speaking too soon could expose incomplete facts. Waiting too long suggested weakness. This dilemma left Starmer trapped between urgency and caution, a position no leader can hold for long without consequences. The scandal's impact spread beyond domestic politics. International media outlets began framing the situation as a leadership collapse rather than an internal party issue. Financial analysts warned that political instability could affect market confidence. Diplomatic partners sought reassurance that governance remained functional. Britain's image of predictability was eroding by the hour. Meanwhile, those who had resigned began shaping the narrative from outside. Anonymous briefings hinted at deep structural problems, and ignored warnings. Each leak reinforced the idea that the collapse was not accidental, but inevitable. Attempts to dismiss these claims only drew more attention to them. Public trust reached a critical low. Polling data suggested rising frustration and fatigue among voters who felt disconnected from the unfolding drama. Many questioned whether accountability would ever be delivered or whether the system would simply absorb the shock and move on. That scepticism deepened cynicism toward the entire political class. As pressure mounted, calls for a full inquiry grew louder. Commentators demanded transparency. Party figures debated leadership challenges. The idea that Starmer could ride out the storm began to feel increasingly uncertain. Survival now depended not just on facts, but on perception. And perception had already turned hostile. This stage of the crisis was defined by silence rather than action. And in politics, silence is rarely neutral. It signals hesitation, vulnerability, and loss of direction. With every unanswered question, the damage became harder to reverse, pushing the leadership closer to a breaking point that few believed could be avoided. As the crisis reached its peak, the focus shifted from what had happened to what could possibly come next. Westminster no longer felt like a centre of control, but a place waiting for impact. Senior figures admitted privately that the situation had crossed into historic territory. Never before had a leadership team collapsed so publicly, so quickly, and under such intense scrutiny. The damage was no longer internal, it had become national. Keir Starmer now faced the most defining moment of his political life. Every option carried consequences. Reshuffling what remained of his team risked highlighting how much had already been lost. Addressing the nation risked exposing gaps in knowledge. Staying silent risked confirming the worst fears of critics. Leadership, once questioned, demands proof, and proof was becoming harder to provide with each passing hour. Inside the Labour Party, conversations turned brutal. Some MPs openly discussed whether the party could survive an election under this cloud. Others argued that removing Starmer would only deepen the chaos. Unity fractured as fear replaced strategy. Loyalty became conditional, tied not to belief, but to survival. The walkout of 43 MPs now looked less like an isolated act and more like the first crack in a widening collapse. Public anger continued to grow. Viewers who watched the scandal break live felt deceived, not just by individuals, but by the system itself. Trust eroded further as explanations remained incomplete. Protest rhetoric intensified online. Calls for accountability became louder, sharper, and more personal. This was no longer passive disappointment, it was active frustration. International observers watched closely, allies worried about continuity, rivals sensed weakness. Britain's image as a stable democracy took a visible hit. Markets reacted cautiously, diplomats adjusted expectations. The ripple effect spread far beyond party politics, touching every layer of national credibility. At the centre of it all stood a Prime Minister increasingly alone. Surrounded by uncertainty, stripped of his inner circle, and facing a public that demanded answers, Starmer's authority hung in the balance. Whether he could recover no longer depended on speeches or statements. It depended on whether trust could be rebuilt in an environment that now thrived on doubt. This scandal will not be remembered only for resignations or walkouts. It will be remembered as the moment stability cracked under live cameras. A moment when power slipped, not through force, but through exposure. And as Britain waits for what comes next, one question remains unanswered. Can leadership survive when belief has already collapsed? As the dust begins to settle, a deeper and more uncomfortable reality is taking shape. This crisis is no longer about one scandal, one broadcast, or one dramatic walkout. It has become a mirror held up to the entire political system, exposing how fragile authority can be when trust collapses all at once. What viewers saw live on television was not just the end of a team, but the breakdown of confidence that had been weakening behind the scenes for a long time. For Keir Starmer, the coming days will define his legacy more than any policy speech or election promise. Even if the facts eventually soften the impact of the scandal, the perception of loss remains powerful. Politics is driven by belief, and belief once broken is slow to return. Every delayed answer, every careful phrase, every controlled appearance now carries more weight than before because the margin for error has disappeared. Within Parliament, the effects continue to ripple outward. MPs who stayed loyal are under pressure from their constituencies. Those who walked out are defending their decision as necessary and principled. The divide has hardened, and healing it will require more than internal meetings or reassurances. It will require visible change, something the public can clearly recognise as different from what came before. The media landscape has also shifted. Coverage has moved from shock to investigation. Commentators are digging deeper, asking how such a collapse was possible and who knew what and when. Each new angle keeps the story alive, preventing it from fading into the background. This sustained attention ensures that accountability, real or perceived, will continue to dominate the political conversation. Public sentiment remains volatile. Many feel anger, others feel exhaustion, some feel detached altogether. This emotional mix is dangerous because it creates space for instability and radical shifts in opinion. When confidence in leadership erodes, people begin searching for alternatives, not always predictable ones. That uncertainty now hangs over every future decision. Internationally, Britain's partners are adjusting expectations. Stability is no longer assumed. Agreements are being reconsidered with caution. Trust, once automatic, now requires reassurance. These subtle changes may not make headlines, but they shape long-term relationships in ways that are difficult to reverse. This chapter is far from over. Whether it becomes a turning point or a prolonged decline depends on what follows next. What is certain is this: the moment the scandal broke live on air, politics crossed a line. From that point forward, nothing about leadership, loyalty or trust could ever be taken for granted again.